In this lesson, we will talk about minimum order quantities. Now, when you start looking for factories, you would notice that a lot of the factories will either say we don't have minimum order quantity, or they would tell you what their minimum order quantity is. Now, smaller factories who don't have minimum order quantity, they tend to perhaps charge more for the one-off productions, the small runs that they would be making. Because you have to remember that the factory does not make money out of sampling. Sampling is a bit of a lost time for them. If factories can never do sampling, they never would. But where factories make money is from the production. When they have a set run of production, X amount of units, they can then work out a schedule, they can dedicate people to that order. And as they are doing more than one unit, as they're doing a few units, etc., they would get faster, they would get to know the product well. And what a factory loves is to for a designer or a brand to give them a product that over time it will keep on repeating, because that means that they know how to make it. They're not going to waste time in getting to know it and find solutions to certain design elements, but they would just jump into the production and be getting more and more efficient with every production. And the faster they do it, the more money they would potentially make. So with that in mind, small factories who don't have minimum order quantity naturally would either charge you more, or they will not be making any money, and therefore they will be running and chasing after different clients to fill the gap, to make money, to pay their bills, etc. And that makes them very erratic and very disorganized. And really, that as you've seen factories, you really need to kind of try to see and spot if there's that element of erraticness, because otherwise they would be the same with you, and you can't run a business with an erratic partner. You cannot then rely on them when they tell you that something will be delivered on such and such date. You cannot then rely on that information, because what happens if someone comes with a bigger order than yours and they jump to make that order because they would pay perhaps in advance of you, and that would help them pay the bills. So you cannot work with businesses like this. So if you are potentially considering to work with a small factory and small unit, just try to talking to them by visiting, just observing the way they speak about their schedule, the way they manage their time. Try to spot if they're one of those factories. And if you have to work with them, that's fine. It's just that as long as you know that, you can then perhaps build a buffer and allow for it. Now, all the other factories, the ones that have minimum order quantities, they would tend to be better organized than bigger factories. And very often factories that have a minimum order quantities will be factories, especially in Europe, who are used to working on the fully factored method. So even if a factory has a minimum order quantity of 20, 30 units, as very often some of the factories I work with in Spain have this kind of requirement, they're still very much open to working on fully factored basis. Now, the reason factories have these minimum order quantities is also not only because it helps them schedule their production, but it also sometimes, especially fully factored factories, these minimums are dictated by the raw material supplier. So imagine you're making a t-shirt. The factory is providing the t-shirt material, and they're buying it from a mill, and this mill may have X amount of meters or kilograms. Jersey materials is often sold in kilograms. That is their minimum, and their minimum is dictated by their machines, because very often machines, to get them going, the first few meters, literally you throw them away. And then once the machine warms up and everything starts, clicking and working properly, then the real production starts. And they can't stop it before they have made X amount of material, because then it would be just not worth their time, the electricity they have spent, etc. So raw material suppliers will have their minimums. They would pass it to the factories, and then the factories, if they're manufacturing for you, they have to make sure that whatever material they buy, they're not going to have leftover, because if they have leftover, what are the chances that the next customer will ask and have the same desire for the same raw material? So very often their minimum requirements are based on raw materials. So if perhaps a minimum, you really like a factory and their minimum tends to be a little bit on the high side, it's really important to dig deep and discuss with them what is driving their minimum requirement. Because if that means that perhaps they would agree to make a little bit less for you, but they sell you the leftover material and you sit on it until you're ready to place another production, that can be a solution. Another way is that even though factories say that, for instance, 50 units per style is their minimum, it's worth to say, I know you're saying it's per style, but does that mean it's per color? Sometimes they'll say yes, but you can be a little bit cheeky, and as you get to know them, etc., you can say, is it possible that we split that over 2 colorways? And sometimes they're open immediately and they say, yeah, that's not a problem. It really just depends, but it depends again on that personal relationship that you would build with the factory. So if you just call up and say, hey, what's your minimum? They would say it's X. But once you get to know them, once you start working with them, that changes. That becomes Y. So when you are working with factories, and they have minimum order quantities, it's really also important to kind of think about where you're coming from and what your brand is about and how you're going to distribute and sell your units, whatever production you commit to. Because if you are looking for a price, for a certain cheap and keen price, you may have to go to factories that require bigger minimums in order for you to meet that price. But if you are new and you don't have the established channels to sell this production, that's dead money. You're better off perhaps paying a little bit more and getting a smaller volume of production, but not sitting on product that you don't know when, if at all, you're going to sell. So it's important to kind of think about how you're going to sell, how many units really can you sell, and not commit to a large volume of units, because, like I said, if you don't sell them, you're sitting on money, and very often, depending on what your product is, it might start perishing, it might start getting damaged, and which means that you just have to write it off. So again, just to recap this lesson, when you're speaking to factories about minimums, find out what is the parameters of this minimum. What are the flexibilities within it? Is it really strictly per style, per color, or can you include a couple of colors in there? What is it driven by? When they say 50, is it really 50, or can it be a little bit? Can it be 40, for instance? I very often have talked to factories that, when I first meet them and I ask them, they say, let's say it's 50. And then once I speak to them, they say, if you give us 40, we'll be okay with that, as long as later on, you start growing, etc. So these things tend to be a little bit flexible, but as you can see, as I've mentioned before, it's a very personal industry where it really depends on the personal relationships between the people working together, and that dictates a lot of the parameters that supposedly they place.